Welcome back, stranger. I see you come here looking for shelter again. Make yourself comfortable, and as you wait for the storm to pass away, let me tell you another story. This story is a story from a long, long time ago, where the mortal realms were in chaos. It was the age of the god king Sigmar, when he had just begun his campaign to take back his lost territory from the Chaos Worshippers. Now, this story takes place in those waking moments, but before I start with this, let me tell you some information I have collected over the years, and from also some of the records that were left behind by the people that lived in those times. You see, they say that before the arrival of the God King to the mortal realms, this world was not ruled by man or by chaos fiends, but it was ruled by drakes. Now, just imagine what the ancient primitive people of the realms would be thinking when they would see the splendid civilizations of dragons flying in the skies, creating cities and culture. But the ancient drakes were not the only dominant species of its time. There were also the Drogoth. These two people had a very uneasy non-aggression pact, as we learn from the writings found in the ancient book of Kragnos, which were painstakingly translated so we were able to read from it on today's world. So I will be reading to you today a little passage from it, the approximation translation of what we think this book says in the ancient Draconid tongue.
The Draconids were a race of skilled dragons like sorcerers, born from the rocky peaks of Gur, the eldest of which were each as large and powerful as one of our mightiest warriors. Though we had no formal alliance between us, Gorgus, the tribal leader, had broken a non-aggression pact between our people. A war between our two peoples could only end in disaster. More than that, we had a common cause, our mutual hatred for the Shaggoth clan that claimed the mountains to the north.
Reading from this passage gives us a little glimpse to the way the people of the ancient times of Gur were thinking like. The fact that their non-aggression pact was very uneasy, and knowing that anything could be the thing that breaks the dam and lets these two great ancient species of Gur going to war must have been very, very stressful when it came to just the regular people that lived in those times, not only for those two great species, but also the lesser species that lived then. But then Kragnos attacked, and war broke out. Many drakes and the Draconids were being slayed side by side and against one another. Now the two mighty people fought for a very long time. We have no idea today for how long it lasted, but it must have been a very long time, and you can just imagine from the point of view of the lesser species, you can only imagine that the war between these two godlike cultures, these two godlike species, would be like to the ancient Oryx, who made cave paintings showing off the great battles, but very few survived the eons of time, and those that have survived, we have painstakingly tried to maintain them in the ancient caves. And from these paintings, from these frescoes that were left behind, we get a little glimpse as to what their point of view was like, seeing these two species fight it off until there were no more. At the end of the war, the two species had become basically extinct, but before everything came to an end, the ancient drakes called upon their long-distant brothers, far more ancient than they were themselves, a people who had survived the destruction of a previous world that today we know it as the world that was, and ancient allies and worshipper of the great Draconids, and who still follow the great plan created by the Old Ones, the ancient race that is said to have created the world that was. And these people, we know them today as the Seraphon. Their leader, the last of the original seers of the great plan, the one known as Lord Krog, the great Lord Krog who has refused to die, who his body is mummified even to this day, but his soul continues to fight on the forces of chaos, see the end of the great plan. Lord Krog himself had foreseen the destruction of the world and fled in their flying cities, but still having a connection to the mortal realms and the despise for the chaos gods, they stood close, for the great plan was all to them. Their flying cities were said to be magnificent, filled with magical power beyond anything we could imagine even today, that even their secrets have been long lost to them. Now most of their technology, their ancient technology, is just used to fight against the forces of chaos. With their connection to the Draconid, they made a pact and imprisoned Kragnos in a mountain, with great losses, but all part of the great plan. And so eons passed, and the two civilizations were now not only extinct, but now relegated to mere legend and folk tales. That even to this day, we find it hard to believe that before, in the ancient past, in the primordial era of the mortal realms, two ancient cities, two ancient cultures existed to this day. It's hard for us to imagine how it must have been like to be there, how it must have been like to see these two great species. And even to this day, the power of the Seraphon, the power of Lord Krog, seems quite unimaginable to us today. And even to themselves, the fact that they've lost ancient knowledge to how and why their ancient technology exists, it is pretty impressive, and it talks about how old the Seraphon truly are. The world moved on and empires rose and fell, but the Seraphon, the ancient people, still remembered. And when Lord Krog had made steps to keep the great plan on course, he attacked one of the seers of the chaos gods, the chaos god that we know as Tzeentch. This year was called the Eater of Tomes. He had created these silver towers that were able to use the empty space of the void to teleport itself in different locations. And he was being attacked by the forces of Sigmar that march in his domain, as it was described in the ancient book of Marathi. This is where Lord Krog made his move and forced the Eater of Tomes to flee with his silver tower. And now, having a battle in the void, the two flying cities fought in the void, suffering many casualties and destructions to their flying cities. But Lord Krog was successful in his plan. When everything was over, the flying city kept going through its path, and the fallen Seraphon warriors and skinks were taken aboard the ship to assist to its repairs. One of these we know as the skink named Tatunek. Thanks to his written record he left behind, is a great avenue to see and imagine how it was like to be there in these great ancient flying cities. And it makes us imagine and just feel this sense of wonder and just awe from what exactly this technology was like. Tatunek writes down that he woke up and did not know where he was, but when he saw a star seer, he knew immediately something important was to come, for his rank was high amongst the Seraphon culture. From his writing, we learned that the Seraphon were aware of the awakening of Kragnos. he speaks to the Starseer and shows the fear that many would feel if they knew what the Seraphon knew. The Seraphon, without any bias, knew that Kragnos could be defeated, but with great losses. Since he was warded against magical attacks, the people of the ancient age of Sigmar did not know that about Kragnos. To them, he was just another mindless beast of the orcs. They were not aware of his power, but the Seraphon knew, for they had fought him before. Tatonek writes that as he walked with the Starseer, he passed frescoes, showing the ancient times where the Drakes and the ancient Seraphons fought against the god of destruction. He describes in great detail how the frescoes depicted the power of the god. Mountains showed to be destroyed, and the fear that he brought to the people of the realm. But in the end, the combined forces of the Drakes and the Slann sealed the god away. From his writing, we can see his fear and probably the fear of the other Seraphon felt, for they did not know the entirety of the great plan, as he writes down in his book, and we managed to get a little phrase just to show it off, the fear that he felt when he saw these frescoes.
But the Draconids are gone, I told the Blessed Master. The end of empires broke them.
We can feel the distress of what it would be like to know that the only people that had the capacity to help them were now gone. But this, as he later writes, was not true, for the Seraphon were tasked to be the keepers of the descendants of the Drakes. He writes that the Starseers took him to a chamber where he is shown what seems to be a stone, but as he watches the stone rock back and forth, he realizes it was not a stone at all, but an egg, and cannot contain his excitement, for he is witnessing the birth of a Draconid. And this for him must have been a very eventful moment, because he is witnessing the rebirth of a species, something that not many of the ancient times of the age of Sigmar did not know there was such thing was being hatched about or even possible, for he cannot contain his excitement of seeing just one egg being hatched. He later writes down that the Starseer corrects him and shows him that it's not only one egg that they had hatched, but many. Now, this is where the problem of one source has. We do not know how many eggs have been hatched at this point, but looking at how many of their skeletal remains we have found in our time, we must assume it had been thousands by then, and more were to be hatched since. He does mention they had only hatched but a fraction of the eggs they were entrusted by the ancient Drakes. But with this, we can feel the hope that he felt, as now their ancient allies were coming back and now they had a shot to defeat the end of empires, Kragnos. But there was a problem, as he writes down. The Draconids refused to fight along the Seraphon, but the Seraphon, being the wise people that they were, they already were planning ways to be able to go around this little problem, as he writes down in his book.
The Starseer raised his hands. Starlight danced around his fingertips. I watched as over my master's head an astrological sigil formed, that of malice, the core of the broken world. Around it, a second layer of starfire blazed like a great ring. Mortals named it the Sigmar Lore, and the symbols of the confluence blazed into existence around the Sigmar marabellum, even as it was draped in the shadow of spreading wings. A new era begins. An era of scales and of storm.
From here we can see that maybe what the wider Seraphon who knew of the drakes being reborn felt like. This pride and joy that they had a chance to stop Kragnos, and the hope that brought with it. Now stepping away from the story, we know that the Draconids find their leadership by the help of the Seraphon, by placing them together with the Stormcast Eternals. The archaeological record and the stories passed down, we know that the forces of Sigmar began to ally themselves with the Drakes and made forces of Sigmarites riding Drakes or fighting alongside them. We know that this helped begin to change the tide to a more even playing field, for the Age of Beasts was now commencing and they needed all the help they could. They needed all the help they could get. But imagining the forces of Sigmar fighting alongside the Drakes must have been a sight to see. And for the Stormcast who rode the Drakes, they must have felt an intense honor, for these Drakes were related to their eternal god, Draconids. So for them, it must have been quite amazing and an honor to be riding those horses and to be able to be sharing a battlefield with their new fellow allies. And also for the Draconids themselves, it must have been a very prideful moment at the fact that they had found the leadership that they were looking for. This is the story of the Scales of Victory, my dear stranger. Hopefully you liked it and felt a little what it was like to be this skink and witnessing the rebirth of his species, and also felt the hope he felt as he saw the Draconids fly in the skies. Hopefully you come back, and if you do, I will be here to tell you more stories about the mortal realms.